In today's episode, we're chatting with an ex-Disney leader on all things customer service and company culture. From Engagement, I'm David Millay, and this is Flip the Switch. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of Flip the Switch, where we sit down with leaders in customer experience and employee experience, and we try to figure out what are the trends that they're paying attention to, what are the experiments that they're running, what are the best practices that have helped drive them to success throughout their career, and then we apply all those things to the world of sports and entertainment, hospitality, service, live events, your business. Now, today we are sitting down with a former Disney leader. We haven't had one on in a while. And today's guest is Dennis Snow. Now, Dennis worked for the Walt Disney Company for over 20 years. And there he developed his passion for service excellence and customer experience. And now he brings that to the world in the form of keynote speaking, workshops, and books. He's authored 2 books, one of which is how I initially stumbled onto Dennis and his work. He began his career in 1979 as a frontline attractions operator, and he moved through the company managing various operating areas throughout the parks. One of those areas that he spent a little bit of time is Disney Institute, which is obviously where I spent my time. I was there for about 6 years, and Dennis spent a ton of time there really starting up the consulting arm of the company. In addition to Disney Institute, he also spent several years with Disney University, which is the internal part of the teaching arm, if you will, of Disney. So within that, he's going to be teaching corporate philosophy and business practices to cast members internally and the leadership team, as opposed to externally, which is what I did at Disney Institute. Now, while he was at Disney University, he coordinated Disney Traditions program, which is universally recognized as kind of the benchmark in corporate training and new employee onboarding. And in his last year with Walt Disney World, his leadership performance was ranked in the top 3% of the company's leadership team. So he doesn't just preach it, he practices it as well. Again, today, full-time speaker, keynote guy, workshop guy, book author. 2 of his books that you can check out, we'll link to in the show notes. First one is the newest one, Unleashing Excellence, the complete guide to ultimate customer service, which is a lot more practical. How do you actually do it in your organization? But the book that I first came across, Dennis, is called Lessons from the Mouse, a guide for applying Disney World's secrets of success to your organization, your career, and your life. Without further ado, let's jump into this episode with Dennis Snow. Dennis, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. I'm glad to be participating in this.
I am always super excited when we have a former Disney colleague, a former Disney leader on the show. And it's been a while since we've had somebody, so I'm excited to jump in.
Yeah, well, you're a former cast member. I'm a former cast member. And you get 2 cast members together and we've got stories to tell.
That's for sure. So let's jump in. So like so many other cast members who spent a lot of their career there, that first job that they took was really just supposed to be a summer job.
That's right.
It was just supposed to start there. So it turned into a 20-year career for you. Right. So talk to us about something like your favorite roles that you had at Disney so that people can get an idea of the scope of time and roles that you had while you were with the company.
Sure. Well, my first job, it was actually at an attraction that's not there anymore. It was I was at 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, the submarine ride. And that's probably still the best job I've ever had. It was wonderful. And as you said, it was just going to be a 3-month job. I had no idea it was going to be a 20-year career. And then I worked at different attractions. It's a Small World, which was the longest 6 months of my entire life, hearing that song over and over again. Got into management and managed different operating areas around the organization. And then I went to the Disney University, which, as you know, is the internal training arm of the company. And that was fantastic because it was new people coming into the organization, going through what we call Disney Traditions, the orientation program that sort of aligned people with the culture, the Disney culture. We did the management training. And then we spun off a division called the Disney Institute, which you're very familiar with, where companies would come down and benchmark best practices with us around customer service, leadership, creativity, and so forth. And I managed a division of that for many years. And then I hit 20 years and I thought, wow, that's a really good round number, 20 years. And I was still relatively young at the time. I thought, I'm going to go out on my own and do training and development and consulting with other companies. So I've been doing that now for 23 years. I can't believe
Holy
that's
cow.
been
Yeah.
longer than I was with Disney. But I still have that Disney mentality that's still very near and dear to my heart.
No question. And I think it's interesting. So, the episode before we recorded with you, we did it with one of our friends, Eric Weisberg. And he spent a much shorter time with the company. And now he's the VP of fan experience with the Tampa Bay Rays. Spent a much shorter time at Disney. But I really do think, especially if you spend your formational years with the company, even if you're only there for a year or 2, that mindset gets deeply embedded into how you approach work, how you approach relationships and people and serving others. And it never leaves you. So yeah, 23 years to 20 years, it makes sense.
I meet people all the time who were cast members at Disney at one point or another. And even if it was just for a short stint, they were on the Walt Disney World College program. And they'll say things like, to this day, I pick up trash off the ground. That I'm a customer service fanatic. I'm always looking for things. I said, and Disney instilled that in me. So yeah, it does stay with you no matter how long you work there. Both of my sons worked at Disney.
Well, I do think we're going to get into that this episode, because I think a lot of people think that there's almost like there's a mystification to that. There's kind of like a mystery, like how do they create a world or a culture where people have only spent a year there and that mindset sticks with them for forever? How do they do that? And so
I always tell them it's something they sprinkle in the food in the cafeteria. But that's not really the answer.
That's the quick answer, right? Well, before we get into all that, I do want to kind of touch on like maybe a great story that best encapsulates your career at Disney, or maybe a favorite story that has been lesser told as you've toured around the world talking to people about Disney.
Yeah, as you know from working there, there's so many that you can think of, but there was a moment that has stayed with me where I was having a bad day. And which we all have, no matter what we do. We have those days where we just want the day to be over. We want to go home. And I was having one of those days. And I was getting ready to leave. And I was the supervisor over the character department in the Magic Kingdom. And I was getting ready to go home, and they were having a character greeting in front of the castle. And I just stopped and watched for a minute, and Snow White was there, and it happened to be Snow White, and kids were lined up to get their autographs and get their picture taken with Snow White. And so I just watched for a minute or two, and this child came up with her parents, hugged Snow White, and Snow White started talking to the child. And I overheard the mom say to Snow White, our daughter is deaf. She can't hear what you're saying. Our daughter's deaf. And Snow White started signing to the child. And it was one of those moments that's frozen in time for me, that I thought, this is what it's all, this is what it's all about. That moment represented the magic to me, and the power of one person's efforts in learning how to sign and being ready at a moment's notice. And so whether that child remembers that or not, I don't know, because it was a young child, but I guarantee you the parents remember it.
No question.
And I remember it, to this day. So it was, and it reinforced for me, that, okay, I'm having a bad day. And here was this moment that just flipped the switch for me. And it was magic. And it reminded me that that's what it's all about. It's those one-on-one moments that you have with somebody that can create a memory that lasts for a lifetime.
Yeah. And I think that is such a great story that does encapsulate the Disney magic. And when we talk about great customer service or great customer experience, specifically service, it really does come from this architected system that is globally pushed down and empowers individuals at an individual level to deliver a genuine moment.
That's a key point.
right?
That people need to feel empowered
Yeah,
to create those moments. There's guidelines, of course,
no
that
question.
that you operate within. But when your people understand that they are empowered to create those moments, that's when they really do start happening and perpetuating themselves. So that's a key leadership point that you just made, is you've got to be willing to trust and empower your people to create
No
those
question.
moments.
No question. Well, let's jump into your book, because I think you've got some really incredible teaching points. Now, you've got two books, and the first book that I came across from you, though, was the Lessons from the Mouse book. I think
Right.
I was reading or buying Dan Cockrell's book at the
Oh yeah,
time,
yeah,
and
yeah. Is a great book.
it's great. He was one of the first guests we had on the
Yeah.
show, and I was buying his book, and I think it got recommended on Amazon. Your book next to it, like people who bought this book also bought Dennis
Lessons
Snow's
from the
book.
Mouse. Yeah,
And I
yeah,
was like, "Oh, great! Let's check it out."
yeah.
So that was when I first came across your work. So maybe we unpack that, because that was where we first jumped in. But then happy to go other places as well.
Sure.
Um,
Yeah, Lessons from the Mouse. What I wanted to do was to create a template that companies could use for how do we create a great experience? What are the key elements? So I went back in time in my mind and thought, what are the key lessons that I learned during that 20-year career? And some of these will be very familiar to you. Never let backstage come on stage. Create moments of wow, because little wows add up. Don't be a customer service robot. Know what frustrates customers and do something about it. So there's 10 lessons that I came up with. These were the things that really stayed with me. Here's what they meant from my Disney days, and then here's how they apply in other organizations. Because I take it to that next step. And what I find is that core service principles can really apply in any organization, whether it's entertainment or sports or retail or any operation. The application might be different. And that's why at the end of each chapter, there's application questions that people can use to apply those principles to their own roles. But these are the 10 things that, to me, really stood out and had an impact on my life. And I think really are at the core of any service-driven organization.
yeah, and they're not rocket science
No, they're
principles,
not.
right?
They're not.
Like I'm looking at
Yeah,
them in front of me, and one of them is everyone has a customer.
right.
Pretty basic, but when you actually get into the application, that
Yeah.
is where the magic comes. And
And the
so
consistency is important. That's the other thing is, yes, you look at it and you say, okay, yeah, I mean, that's obvious, but are you doing it?
mm,
And are you doing it consistently? And from my consulting and training work, the answer more often than not is no, we're really not. They get that embarrassed
yeah,
look on the no, we're really not doing that consistently.
well,
Well, that's where the application comes into play.
we would always say at Disney Institute, these are common sense things. They're not common practice, though.
Exactly.
And that's
Yeah.
where it comes. So of these, where again, a lot of these are common sense, but not common
Mhm.
practice, do you feel like there's one that organizations struggle with more than others?
Well, I find the biggest one that there's two that I find that organizations struggle with.
Let's go into
One
them.
is don't be a customer service robot, because what happens is, especially over time, we get into a routine and we start processing people, right? And we've all lived with that, whether we're talking to a service provider on the phone, we're interacting face to face at a venue. And they're just sort of processing you, as you're entering a sports complex. They're just sort of processing you through, and it becomes robotic, especially over time. It becomes robotic. And so one of the things at Disney and what I think world-class organizations do is they capture those routine processes and say, how do we personalize them? And so there's just that genuine greeting, that smile as people are coming through. One of the things when I would load people on the rides at Disney, kids would have the mouse ears with their names stitched on the back. And I'm counting people, I'm counting them to go on the submarine ride, but there was no reason not to say, as the kid goes by with the name on the back of the mouse, you say, "Hey, Bobby, how are you?" And it would just freak the kid out because they said, "How did he know who I was?" And the parents, of course, knew exactly what you did.
Exactly.
But it was taking what could be a very robotic task and turning it into an experience. And so that's what I mean about not being a robot. So it's identifying those routine processes that are part of any role in an organization, and how can we personalize them? How can we add that personal touch? And it's not about throwing money at it. It's not about throwing time at it. It's about changing the approach that you take to it. So that was one of them. The other one you touched on earlier is everybody has a customer. One thing that I find in organizations is that oftentimes people who don't deal with external customers don't think this customer service stuff applies to them. And it does.
Yeah.
It's just your customer is somebody within the organization. If you weren't serving somebody, your job wouldn't exist, right? I mean, we're all serving somebody. So the principles are the same. The application, again, might be different, but I have yet to come up against an organization that can deliver fabulous external service if their internal service stinks.
No question. And I'll expand on that last part a little bit. Like, do you remember Michael Feldman? Did that name?
Yeah, that name rings a bell. Yeah.
So Michael I actually ran into him the other day down in Orlando, but he was our legal for Disney Institute.
Okay.
And I probably learned more from him for things that I use today as I'm like writing contracts with clients and things than I did from the majority of cast members that I spent a lot of time with. But part of that was because he viewed us as Disney Institute as his customer.
Yeah.
Even though his job, like his role was to protect the company.
Yeah.
His purpose was to create happiness for Disney Institute and helping us get the job done.
Yeah.
And so there was often times where he would say, look, like, how badly do you want this deal? Right. Because I could say, we're going to stick on this point and this point and this point,
right.
but you might not get the deal done. I'm like, I want it pretty bad. And he's like, all right, well, I got to protect the company here, but also,
and here's why.
And here's why.
Yeah.
And let's try to go win this and convince the client. But at the end of the day, we'd be okay walking away from we'd be okay waiving this clause because we know that it's important to you guys. And my job is to serve you, Disney Institute. And there are not many legal teams that act like that.
No, there are. That's funny. The result of that is, and this is going to sound cliche, but it is absolutely true at Disney, you do feel like a family. Because everybody is aligned with what Disney is trying to create. So they're truly, even though there can be sometimes, conflict, as with any organization, you all feel like you're on the same mission, versus a bunch of different silos with different missions. So that was one of my favorite things about Disney is we all felt like we were in it together.
Yeah. And I do think a big part of that is because everybody had that mentality of everyone has a customer, right? I'm serving someone, even if it's internal.
Yeah. And a lot of organizations don't get that. And so many times I'll work with people who serve internally and they kind of have their arms folded with, what is this going to have to do with me?
Yeah.
And then as you start unpacking it and you start talking about it, they say, this has everything to do with me. Because this person on the other side of the room is my customer. That's the person that I serve. And so everybody having that mindset.
Yeah. And it trickles down. So,
yeah.
Well, let's jump into another one of your 10 lessons here, talking about figuring out what ticks off your customers and doing something about it. So other than kind of social listening or making notes from customer service phone calls, do you have any favorite tactics to really dive into what ticks customers off?
Yeah. Well, and some of those things that you just mentioned are important. I mean, they really are, to have multiple touch points where people can communicate things that might be frustrating. So those kinds of things, listening in, doing side by sides at the contact center, very important. But I believe and I coach clients on this all the time, the number one resource for finding out what frustrates customers are your frontline employees, because they deal with the same issues over and over and over. And oftentimes they know more than the customer knows about what frustrates them, because they get the themes, from the conversations and the discussions that they're having. So regular meetings with nothing else on the agenda. Most organizations, they have some kind of team meeting, whether it's virtual, face-to-face, departmental, whatever. Most organizations have some way that they get their team together. And to have nothing else on the agenda 4 times a year, so once a quarter, what are you finding frustrates the people we serve? Whether that's external customers or internal. What are some of the things that frustrate? All right, yeah. Okay, let's take 1 or 2 of those things that really are sources of frustration. What can we do about them? What can we do about those frustrations? And you're not going to solve every single issue, but let's say you come up with 4. Every department comes up with 4 solutions a year that at least alleviate customer frustrations. That's world class. That's what, one of the examples that I always loved at Disney was, when a child is not tall enough to go on one of the rides and they get all the way up to the front of the ride, they missed all the signs, the height signs, they get up there, they can't get on the ride. And, the child's in tears because the family can go, the child can't go. So half the group stays with the child, the other half goes on the ride. But that doesn't solve the issue for the child. So they came up with, by having this kind of discussion, these future rider certificates that the next time you come back and the child is tall enough to go on the ride and the cast member is giving this certificate to the child, you and your family go right to the front of the ride. Give the person working here the certificate. You go right to the front of the line in front of everybody. And now you've created a hero for that child, because he or she knows the next time they come back right to the front of the line. And it came about by identifying that's a frustration that people have. And what can we do about it? And it's literally a piece of paper. When you boil it down, it's a piece of paper.
It's a valuable piece of paper.
Yeah, I think the dads go out in the parking lot and sell these things.
I know. Well, because at the end of the day, too, I mean, from a financial perspective, what's going to happen when that kid gets home? That piece of paper is pinned on his wall, and every week he's saying, "Mom, Dad, measure me." And you better believe once he hits 48 inches, he's saying,
"We're
going back to Disney."
They probably measure themselves every day, grow their hair out, and
it's a great customer retention tool too.
Yeah,
and,
sure. And you're here, and again, you think about the parents thinking that was really nice, and again, it's a piece of paper. At the end of it, it's a piece of paper. But it came about, and it came about by what frustrates those we serve. So that's why I go back to our frontline people are just an untapped resource for what frustrates customers and what can we do about it.
I want to kind of go deeper a little bit here. One of my favorite questions to ask frontline people to elicit information is, what are we saying no to? Mm-hmm. So that's one. Do you have any other questions? Because I think you were a leader there for a long time. So are there other questions that you can dig in besides just what frustrates? What are you saying no to? Can you think of any other ones, or do you feel like those two
and what frustrates you? What takes up your time when you're dealing with a guest or a customer? What takes up your time to deal with that particular situation? Okay, what can we do about it? When you're watching things, what things do you see confuses people? And that could help with your signage and those kinds of things. Where do you see customers struggling? They're coming back, they're at a sports arena and they're juggling, 6 drinks in their hands. What are you seeing that are sources of frustration or problems for people? Just watching at Disney, where do people look confused? Where are they trying to, okay, well, that's a good play in terms of signage. Okay, maybe we need better signage at that location. But it ultimately comes down to asking,
Yeah.
And acknowledging these frustrations. I don't care what business you're in, there are frustrations.
Yep.
Okay, there are customer frustrations. So what can we do?
Those are great.
A good example that we've all dealt with is the repair company, for example, that's coming to repair your washing machine. And you say, okay, and they say we'll be there between 9 and 3, right? We'll be there between 9 and 3. Now, I don't know about you, but that's not a really convenient thing for me to have to. Okay, I can't go anywhere between 9 and 3. So what do? Well, they run into problems. They run into where they're at one location for a longer time. And so some of the more progressive organizations, they'll shorten the window. And we'll stay in touch with you via text or phone call or whatever. We'll stay in touch with you, let you know when we're about an hour away from coming to your place. So you can go out and do your shopping, run an errand, go to lunch. You get a text, okay, we'll be there in an hour. Okay, time to go home because they're on their way. So that's a little thing, but it addresses a major frustration that we have as customers.
No doubt, no doubt. Yeah. So asking the question is huge, and then doing something about it. I think too, organizations get caught up from what I've seen of when they ask a question, getting caught up in, okay, now we got to make this big change. Right. And I think one of the big takeaways every time we talk with Jesse Cole, our friend at the Savannah Bananas, who's great, he's big on small bets. Yeah. Right. And I think, and we were too at Disney, right? You hear that. Mm-hmm. Don't just totally change your operation based on that information you heard. Take a small bet. You got to do something about it, but test it. Test it before you start to go roll it out. And that makes the change a lot less intimidating, I've found.
Yeah. And I remember years ago, we were running into a problem where people would rent strollers. And this is back in the day when we had these huge, heavy strollers for children. And people boarding the steam train on Main Street to go to Frontierland, they weren't allowed to bring the strollers onto the train because they were just too big. They were too clunky, too big. And it was a frustration because then they would have to go to the stroller park at Frontierland. So they said, okay, what do we do? Well, they were going to design a car for the train that they could put strollers on, which would have been easily, $500,000, $1 million to build this thing. And they had this conversation. One of the persons said, well, why don't we give the person getting on the train a little card that they leave their stroller here when they get off the train in Frontierland? We have a stock of strollers there. They give the card to the attendant, get a new stroller, off they go. That's what they did. And the price of that solution was a little card, these cards that they created.
A lot of frustration.
So they went from $1 million solution to a card to handle the exact same problem.
Amazing. Well, last question here on lessons from the mouse. I want to talk a little bit about terminology. We talk about this on the show often and with our clients about how important language is as we try to drive certain key behaviors. But there are a bunch of little things like the phrase little wow, seeming kind of like an oxymoron. So talk to us about like just little wow and how do you coach staff to deliver that?
Yeah. So little wows are things like that smile when somebody comes into the facility, that friendly greeting, the fond farewell, the reading the names off the back of the Mickey Mouse ears and calling the child by name, offering to take the photograph of a family so that the designated family photographer can also be in the photograph. That those are little wows. And the point that I make is little wows add up. Okay, that little wows do make it. Taken individually, maybe they're not a big, that big of a deal. But you put enough of those little things together. You think of somebody at a sporting event, the number of points of contact that are going to happen. It just those little wows. Now, the way to coach those starts with the training process. So when you're onboarding new hires and you're doing on-the-job training, just introducing people to these potential little wows that you can do, that's a big part of it. But I also think that getting people to share stories. I think the best way to open up an employee meeting when you're having a virtual gathering, in-person gathering of employees, your Monday morning huddle, whatever you want to call it. A great way to start it off is somebody share with me a wow that you did or you saw somebody did that created a moment of wow for a customer or a guest. And getting people comfortable sharing these examples, because what happens is people hear these examples and think, I could do that. That's a great idea. I never thought of that before. And these little wows start to perpetuate. And as an employee, you start building this toolkit, this imaginary toolkit of little wows that you can do, that when the opportunity arises, you're ready to pounce on that. So again, I always think that one of the best ways to coach people on these things is, yes, introduce them in the formal training that you do, but just getting people talking and telling stories and sharing examples, that perpetuates the culture of creating moments of wow.
Amazing. I have one more question, I guess, that I could ask. Sometimes I feel like people get hung up on the word wow, and they think it's almost like too big, even though you're saying little wow.
Right.
I'm still looking for that word that's like a little softer than wow, especially because we work with a lot of sports teams. So you have employees that they're showing up there 6 times a year, right?
Yeah.
They barely know where the bathrooms are, and you're trying to tell them to create a little wow. So I'm still looking for that word that's like slightly softer than wow, but I haven't found it yet. So if you've got one, I'm here for it.
I guess I'm of the opinion, don't give up on it.
Just keep driving,
because that wow is there's an emotional connection, and I get the eye rolls. I do, and when I'm working with frontline employees and organizations, I get I get the eye rolls.
I'm familiar with it,
and I say I hear, and I'll say it's our fault, as the trainers or as the leaders, because what we do is we tend to use these huge, wow, time-consuming examples. And that's why I think the best examples that we can use are just those little things that just create that moment of wow. Now, the big things are great when we can do them, but those are the ones that are hard to do, especially when you're really busy. If you're working in an entertainment venue or a sports venue, you're dealing with thousands and thousands of people. Sometimes it's really hard to do those huge, I'm going to escort you across the arena to, another food location that has exactly what. Okay. Now, when you can do those, you should. All right. Yeah. Big wows, the big wows are made of those things. But the magic is in those little wows. And so I would say to the listeners, don't give up on the word wow, because there's that emotion. You want your customers to feel, wow, that was a great experience. Well, what made it a great experience? It was a bunch of little things. I can't really pinpoint one major. It was a bunch of little things. And, you think about some of the best sporting events that you've ever attended. And when I think, in Orlando, some of the best sporting events I've attended, I don't remember who won the game, but I remember the experience of being at the game. And, those are the kinds of things that my son and his son, so my grandson and my son were at a Orlando Magic game the other night. And my grandson, who's 5, was crying. He was crying, and he was really upset. And Nick Anderson, who's one of the announcers for the Orlando Magic now, he used to be an Orlando Magic player, he saw my grandson crying, and he just came over and talked to him, and got him to stop crying and talk to him. And I have no idea if the Magic won the game. I don't know if they won the game, but I saw the pictures, I saw the video of Nick Anderson calming my 5-year-old grandson, and I'll remember that forever.
No question. Well, let's move on to your second book here, because this is where first part of this podcast, we talked a lot about the concepts of why service is important and what are some of the little principles. But I think in your second book, Unleashing Excellence, you're really providing a how-to for creating this culture of service. We get a little bit more organizational
Yeah.
and tactical in that
Yeah.
book. So let's jump into that, because I do think it's important for people to understand it, because that's where it's great to understand these concepts. It's great to get inspired by them, but the devil is in execution.
Right.
And that's where I think Unleashing Excellence really starts to dive in. So I want to talk about this just real quick. So everything kind of has to be viewed from this customer's lens, right? And if you understand the customer emotions, you're going to understand the customer needs.
Right. Right.
So is this coaching empathy? Is this something that you can do, or do you really have to start at the very beginning and just hire people for that?
I believe you really have to hire people for it. And I always tell people it really, it begins with defining what's the experience you want to create. Okay, so that it starts with that. What is the experience that you want to create for your customers, your guests, etc. And what has to happen in order to create those things? So I always, when I work with organizations, I'll say, what are 3 things you would want your customers to say about their experience? Okay, now what has to happen for them to say those 3 things? So now you're really thinking behaviorally, you're thinking tactically, and those kinds of things. So let's use empathy as the example. Let's say empathy is one of the key factors to getting people to be loyal to your organization. It's really hard to teach people who don't have an empathetic bone in their body to be empathetic. So you have to design your hiring process around making sure we're bringing in people who have that trait, that's part of who they are. And then in the training, you say, here's how we apply this empathy in our organization. This is what it looks like at excellence in our organization. But they've got to bring the raw materials to the table. So I always say, if you're going to spend your time somewhere, hiring the right people is a really good place to spend it. And I recognize it's not easy right now. And I think that makes this point even more important, that we always have to be in recruitment mode. We always have to be looking and thinking about, if you get great service somewhere, give them your business card and say, if you're ever looking for a job, I would love to talk to you about our facility or our park or whatever it may be. I would love to talk to you about that, because you're exactly what we're looking for. So you always have to be in recruitment mode and hire those traits in. And then, okay, let's align then those traits with our culture. And this is what it looks like, sounds like in our organization.
It's a great place to start. Now, I want to get into this kind of structures, and because I think in the book you laid out a lot of again tactics for how people can go about creating this culture of service if they currently aren't in that spot. So talk to us about kind of this kind of service improvement team that you discuss in the book, and what that looks like and how you've seen that operate in different formats.
And that can be overwhelming for some folks. And when we wrote the book, Unleashing Excellence, we wanted it to be able to cover just about any size organization. So the service improvement team is really designed, for a corporation that has thousands and thousands of employees, multiple departments worldwide, where you create these teams and subcommittees that are all linked together, and it works very, very well. But what I would say to your listeners is the important part are the elements of the service improvement team. One person could do them. A few people could do them. So it's again, defining what you want the service experience to be. How do you communicate that to the team? How do you train and reinforce that? How do you hire people that are wired that way? How do you hold people accountable for it? What are some recognition programs that can support it? So look at it as kind of a linear process that you can start getting traction right away by just immersing your people in what's the experience we're trying to create. And you'll see immediate results just by having that discussion, getting people talking about it. But then the things that really lock it into the culture going forward is, all right, are we hiring the right people? Have we built formal training processes that introduce those folks to our culture? Are we communicating relentlessly about it? And you know from your Disney days, that message of the guest experience is relentless. It's around you all the time. How do we best recognize people who are delivering at excellence? You know, the Partners in Excellence Award and all of those kinds of things. What do we do if somebody's not delivering on those? So performance appraisals, job descriptions, you know, all of those at some point in the process need to evolve. Now that doesn't have to happen on day one. You know, those are things that can happen down the line. So when you look at the service improvement team, what I would say is more importantly is to look at the elements of it that have to be done. If you're an organization that's large enough that can put together these teams, great. If you're not, and I've worked with banks, I've worked with stores who 2 or 3 people, they kind of manage the whole process, but they do it in a linear fashion so that it's not overwhelming. Because sometimes people, they see that and they get kind of overwhelmed by, oh my God, that's so
Yep.
much work we have to do. That's why I say, you know, it takes 12 to 18 months to do this, because all of these things at some point have to be done. They don't have to be done on day one.
So I'm looking at the chart right now, right? And again, they don't all have to be done at once, and it's more important to just kind of like take a look at all the different areas and tackle them kind of one by one. But I'm going to go through them real quick just to recap. So you got service tools, communication, training and education, interviewing and selection, measurement, recognition, service obstacle system, accountability, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if I'm listening to this, I'm thinking all of those are internal.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where oftentimes we get calls, or, and I know you do as well, where people are like, well, I don't understand why we're working on all these internal things. We hired you to make our customer experience better or our customer service better. Why aren't we just training our people how to go out and interact with our people better?
Yeah.
Why aren't we just training our employees to go interact with our fans or our employees better? And I think that is the point here, is that you can't just do that.
Right.
I mean,
I mean, you can.
you certainly can. It's not
Yeah.
sustainable, but
Right. It's not exactly. That's the thing, is you don't want it to be a flavor of the month program.
right.
And we've all dealt with that. And I'm a realist. Oftentimes when we introduce something like this to an organization, the frontline employees, as we talked earlier, obviously sometimes they roll their eyes. Here we go again. And when you're not listening and they're just talking with each other, they're like, wait it out, just wait it out. You know, it'll go
Yeah.
away, like last year's flavor of the month program. What this does is what this approach does is it builds it into the culture, is it makes sure that it's not a flavor of the month program. It's a sustainable approach that says this is the direction we're headed in.
Yeah.
And so organizations that I've worked with, the ones that I've seen that have really gotten traction are ones in various forms of this framework have applied each one of these things to their operation over a period of time. They've done the launch, they've gotten people involved, they've talked about it, they've gotten some traction, but then they're starting to weave it into, okay, let's evolve our hiring process and our job descriptions and all to include all of this. That takes a little bit of time to do. Let's evolve our new hire onboarding process to include this. So that it's not reliant just on me and my way of doing it. That no, this is part of that takes a little bit of time to this. Let's look at how we measure the customer experience. Okay. So the ones that I've seen that have really gotten results are the ones that stick with it over a period of time.
Agreed.
And again, they don't have to do it all at once, because that can just be a wave that crashes over the organization. But these are all things that at some point need to be done if you're going to sustain. You know, you have to look at your accountability processes. At the end of the day, we have to hold people accountable for delivering a great experience. So what do you do if they're not? Well, then we've got to have a coaching process. It's got to be built into our performance appraisal process. You can't argue with that. Again, that's not going to happen day one, but at some point it needs to happen.
And when we think about accountability too, I mean, it's even for the people that are implementing these initiatives, right? That's why I think a lot of this, it's if it's not starting at the very top,
Yeah.
This is likely something. This kind of change or shift is likely not somebody's day-to-day job, task, and responsibilities.
Right.
This is something that is being added on.
Yeah.
And so that's where I think even accountability comes for the people that are leading these initiatives, because it's got to come from the very top, because at the end of the day, that's not probably what's in their performance review is not the success of this program, unless you go back and add it in
and you add it into the form. And I remember when I was working there, there were three things that as a leader, I was held accountable for: the guest experience, whoever it is, whether it was the external or the internal, the guest experience, the cast member experience, so the people who worked for me, and business results, whether that's revenue or whether it's cost controls, whatever it may be. That there were three elements that I was held as a leader held accountable for, and it created that balance of leadership where it wasn't just on the finances. That's my focus. No, I was held accountable for the experience we were creating for whoever it is we were serving, the external or the internal, the people who reported to me. I was held accountable for the cast survey results for that, and then my business results, whichever form that took. So I couldn't neglect any aspect of my responsibility. I was held accountable for each of those things, and it created that balance as a leader. And it helped me as a leader too, to know that those were the three things that I was going to be held accountable for.
Those three frameworks apply to anyone in any role.
Absolutely.
I mean, even for us at Disney Institute, where we were not in the parks, right? We were still held accountable to cast experience, guest experience, and business results. And I think whether you're working for a retail organization or a sports team or a restaurant group, all three of those things should be the framework that you probably are looking at. How do we measure results?
Because it creates the balance. And what I find, this is just anecdotal evidence, I don't have any hard evidence on this, but what I find in many, many organizations is what most leaders are held accountable for are the business results. Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
This is the business results. Now, we do have to be held accountable for those things. But if we're leaving bodies in our wake to create those business results, that's not sustainable. That's you're going to get some short-term wins, but that's not sustainable. You can't do that. So that three-legged stool is a really, really good accountability approach for a leader in any organization.
I love it. Well, we've talked a lot about hiring the right people. It really starts there, getting the right people in the door. One thing that we're wrestling with right now is moving past this HR formality of tasks and qualifications that are rolled up into these job descriptions, right? So this has been the case with a few different clients where we're looking at the team that's there and we're like, hey, we've got to mix this up a little bit. Mm-hmm. And the way to do that is you kind of got to switch up job descriptions, right? What they're currently doing is not what we need them to be doing to deliver great customer experience. So let's rewrite these job descriptions so that we can capture and bring people in that can do those things.
Right.
But again, we're kind of stuck and handcuffed by some of this HR formality that, hey, we've got to lead. The first sentence has got to be, you've got to be vaccinated or whatever it might be.
Right.
You've got this corporate jargon that starts, and by that point, you've lost the opportunity to emotionally hook somebody into the job. So the people that we're looking for are already going to be opting out. So how have you advised organizations to move past that? How have you seen people do that?
And you're right. It is frustrating because a lot of it is legal issues, so there are things they really do have to build into the job descriptions, from a legal standpoint. So that's a tough situation. But when I work with organizations, and I'm helping them define their service values. What are the service values that are important to creating that experience? Being knowledgeable with our customers, being approachable, whatever they may be. So it depends on the organization. Um, Taking those things and building those values into the job description at the beginning of this is who we are from a values standpoint. This is what differentiates us in terms of creating an experience for whoever it is we're serving. So not taking out the other things, because again, I have all the respect in the world for the HR folks, because that's a moving target. There's so many things coming at them constantly. And so they've got a tough job. So all I'm saying is add this to it at the beginning that defines who we are as a culture. So now as I'm looking at that job description, I'm thinking, oh, this is kind of cool. This is something I want to be part of. Okay. Now I have to be vaccinated. Okay. I'm not supposed to steal. Okay. All of those things that are built into every job description. But start off with the emotional connection, the things that make you different as an organization.
We're on the same page there. I'll let you know. We're going to send this to those clients and say, hey, see, it's not just us. Right? It's not just us preaching that. Too funny. Well, I think one other thing when we think about hiring people is once we've hired them and they come on board, that first day, that brag-worthy first day is so important.
Yeah.
And you led traditions, if I'm not mistaken, at Disney University for a long time. So for people that don't know what traditions is, maybe talk about Disney's brag-worthy first day and then some things that people have done, especially now with flexible work and hybrid work, how that plays in.
Now, the timing of Disney traditions, the length of time has varied over the years, depending on what's happening. It's varied over the years. But the fact is, the very first day that somebody joins the organization, they're not thrown out on the job of, okay, now you start doing, serving hamburgers or whatever it may be. You go through Disney traditions, which back in my day, it was a day-long training program that introduced you to the culture. And I'll expand on that in just a moment. Then the second day, you got into more of the specific, here's what you get fired for, those kinds of things. And then starting on day 3 is when you started your on-the-job training. And again, the time frame has varied over time, but that's the flow. That's the flow. Is here's who we are, and this is what we're all about. Here's some of the rules of the road of being a Disney cast member. Now let's start training you specifically on your job, incorporating those things into the training. But that said, I think that magical what did you call it? It wasn't a magical first day. What did you call it? A brag-worthy first day. I love that phrase. I think it includes 3 things. And when I think back to traditions, these were the 3 things that stood out to me. Is it made me proud of the organization. So they told a lot of stories and examples. Where did we come from? How did this all start with Walt Disney? People joining Disney today, they have no idea about, Walt Disney died in 1966. So where did this all come from? How did this come about? And kind of the flow of where the company started and where it's gone. And it builds that pride. And they use stories and examples of that in that onboarding process. The second thing that I think that brag-worthy onboarding creates is what's our true product? What are we really selling? And at Disney, yes, we have rides and attractions, but what we're really providing is an experience. And that's where you come in. Is creating that experience. So again, telling stories. What does that look like? You think about a sporting event. I told you earlier, I've had wonderful events that I've gone to, sporting events. I don't remember who won the game, but I remember aspects of that experience. So they talk about what does that look like? What does that sound like? And they have some fun with it, but it gets people, okay, I get it. And you see the light bulb starting to go on. And then the third thing that I think it creates is an understanding of what's expected. So as a cast member, if one of the things that creates magic for our guests is how pristine the park is. That's one of the top, as you know, one of the top compliments that they get is the park's so clean, and the hotels are so pristine. Well, what does that mean to you as a cast member? Well, what that means to us is if we see a piece of trash on the ground, we go over and pick it up and throw it away. That's why it creates that guest experience. You see the person getting ready to take a photograph of their family and just invite them. Hey, get in the photo. Let me take it for you. So I get it now. I get it. Okay, so that's how I'm part of all of this. So that brag-worthy first impression is the person is now proud of the organization. You want them calling people when they finish up that orientation. This is the most amazing place. So, that it creates that. This is our true product. Yes, we have a football game or we have an attraction, but the product is the overall experience, from start to finish. And then this is your role, and this is what's expected from you as a cast member, your role in that. So now at the end of that period, whatever form it takes place in which it takes place, you've got this person now who's primed, and ready to go out for the next step, which at Disney is, okay, now here are the rules of the road, some of the more typical HR stuff, and then the on-the-job training. But it's all linked together. It starts with that emotional connection. Now, the other side of your question is, with some people working remotely. Well, clients that I've worked with, they've done the same thing. They've created virtual training programs. I personally think the in-person live way is
always going to be better,
superior, is the way to go. But hey, it's the reality of the world. You can do this virtually. You can do the same thing in a virtual training program, where you're focused on pride, true product, what's expected, make it interactive, and that can be interactive where we actually have a trainer on the other end, or the system is an LMS system that's set up to be interactive. So yes, you can do it. And a lot of my clients do that. They do it virtually. But the elements don't change.
Right. The first principles stay the same. It's just your delivery mechanism that's different.
Right.
And I think everything that you've talked about is great, because it's such a good tool. And especially if you're thinking, wow, that's a lot, it is, but that's what you want. Because I remember my first day at Traditions, and my dad worked there at Disney for 20 years. So I knew what I was getting into. Yeah. Did you know Mike Millay? He was over at ESPN Wide World of Sports and Disney Wide World of Sports.
That sounds really familiar. Yes, I'm sure our paths crossed at some time.
I'm sure they crossed because he was there. I don't know. Yeah. Anyway, he was there 20 years. But so at Traditions, my first time, you did have the spectrum where you had the guy that's crying when Mickey comes in to deliver the badge, and you're like, all right, that guy gets it. And then you've got the girl sitting next to me that's like, this seems terrible. Like, why are we here learning all this? I'm like, you're not going to last 90 days.
Yeah, you're not going to make it.
This is just the start. But it is. And she left the room like, is this really what I want to get into?
Right.
And that is the point. You want to create a culture where people opt out because the culture expectations are so strong, and you want to deliver that from the jump. It helps everybody.
Well, and that goes back to the hiring process too, of doing everything you can to screen those folks out at the beginning. Yeah. And they have that video when you go through orientation through the hiring process, that kind of introduces you to, here's the reality, here's the peek behind the curtain of what it's really like to work here, and that it is hard work. And they find that people do screen themselves out, but now and then people squeak through that. They know how to be interviewed. They can squeak through, but it comes to light pretty quickly.
It does.
And those folks don't last.
Well, Dennis, any parting words for us, advice for our listeners, any last thoughts you want to leave everybody with?
Yeah, I think the main thing that I would say is from a leadership perspective is you have to have a clear vision of what the experience is supposed to be, and a crystal clear vision of this is the experience we're trying to create for our spectators, for our guests, whatever it may be. This is the experience we're trying to create. By defining what do we want our customers to say and think about the experience, then, okay, what has to happen in order for them to say or think those three things? And that provides you a launching pad for everything else, of getting your people involved, redesigning your hiring process, redesigning your recognition programs, and all of those other things. But it starts with getting your people engaged in what we're trying to create.
Mm-hmm.
If you just do that and get people talking about it and thinking that way, you're going to get some immediate wins. You're going to get, and you can feel an energy, but you have to sustain it. And that's where all of these other things come into play. You're taking those same raw materials, you're just weaving them into, okay, so how do we hire people? How do we train people? How do we communicate with them? How do we hold them accountable? But you're taking those same raw materials and weaving them into all of those processes.
It's a great spot to end us. Dennis, where can people reach you or follow along your journey?
Sure.
We're going to put links to both of your books in the show notes.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Check them out on wherever you buy your books. But where can people reach you, Dennis?
Yeah, what we try and use is my website as the hub for everything. So it's www.snowassociates.com. And so reaching me, seeing videos, going to my blog, my books, all of those things. We try and use snowassociates.com as the hub just to make it easy for people to get to all those channels. But it's a topic I love to talk about, to write about. And if people have questions, they're more than welcome to call or email me. They can get me at dennis@snowassociates.com. I'm always willing to give them my opinion, right or wrong. I'm always willing to share my opinion.
Well, and Dennis, we might have to bring you into a project or two here this next year. Now that we've started this. So anyway, Dennis, thank you so much for coming on the show, and looking forward to our next conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
To all our listeners, we'll see y'all next week. Hey guys, before you head out, just wanted to say thank you so much for listening to the show. If you enjoyed it, head over to iTunes to subscribe, rate, and leave a review. That helps more of your peers find the show as they search for ways to get better in their own roles. But this podcast is just a small part of what we do at Engagement. In our normal day in the office, we're crazy focused on helping athletic departments and sports and entertainment companies generate more revenue by becoming more customer-centric. To see how we might be able to help your organization, visit engagementpartners.com to learn more. Download a free guide, check out our blogs and case studies, or schedule a call with us if you want to see how we can help with your particular objectives. Our goal is to help you create deeper connections with fans and generate more revenue. So when you're with us, hopefully you find a nugget or two that helps your cause.